The egg splattered across Scotty Moore's guitar, creating a strange, squelching sound that echoed through the microphone. The crowd in Philadelphia went wild, but not in the way Elvis was used to. Instead of screams of adoration, there were gasps of shock and a few angry shouts. The egg thrower, a college kid in a trench coat, tried to bolt, but he didn't get far. The little girls in the front row, who had been screaming and swooning just moments before, now turned on him with a ferocity that surprised everyone. They started hitting him with their purses, fists, and anything else they could swing. Elvis, standing on stage with a microphone in his hand, just stared at the chaos for a second. Then he shrugged, broke into a grin, and started singing "Don't Be Cruel" like nothing had happened. The crowd, confused but still enamored, joined in, and the show went on. But the egg incident was just one more crazy thing in a tour that had already seen its fair share of bizarre moments. A few weeks earlier, in St. Louis, a reporter and a photographer had shown up at our hotel, poking around and taking pictures of my laundry. They were looking for Elvis, but when they realized he wasn't going to appear, they cussed us out for wasting their time and costing them $50. It was a small victory, but it felt good to see them scurry off. On another night, at the Kiel Auditorium, I was getting ready for the show when a security guard came backstage looking for me. I identified myself, and he told me there was someone at the gate asking for me. I couldn't think of anyone I knew in St. Louis, but I followed the guard to the gate. There, standing with a grin on his face and an arm around his wife, was the big Marine who had accused Elvis of assault after our dragging Maine incident in Memphis. "Hello, sir," he said. "Do you remember me?" Yeah, I do." "Well, is there any chance Mr. Presley might get us into the show?" I headed back to tell Elvis, but when he heard who was asking for free tickets, he exploded. "Screw that SOB," he shouted. I didn't know what to tell the Marine, but Elvis made it clear he wasn't going to help. Elvis could be a nice guy, but he had a temper, and when he got angry, you didn't want to be around. That temper showed itself again in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where we performed in a hockey arena. The high boards around the floor were a new experience for us, and the security guards had to explain what they were for. In Detroit, Elvis handled the press in a new way. He had a fling with a pretty young UPI reporter named Gail Green, who later became a famous restaurant critic. In Buffalo, New York, we had our first bomb scare, but the show went on without any real danger. And in Toronto, Elvis and I got some funny looks from a Mountie when we asked who the lady was in a big picture hanging in Maple Leaf Gardens. "That's the Queen of England, sir," he replied. We'd never seen a picture of her before. But the crazy moments weren't just about the shows. My job was to provide Elvis with companionship and conversation, but there was hardly any time for that. We traveled in trains, limousines, and Cadillacs, rolling into town, getting to a hotel, getting to a theater, hitting the stage, partying at the hotel, and then doing it all over again. Sometimes we'd tape newspaper over the limo windows to keep the backseat dark enough for Elvis to get some sleep. I got used to recognizing cities by the back entrances to hotels and the alleyways behind the auditoriums. The band members didn't mind flying, so they traveled separately. They stayed in different hotels, too, which seemed weird to me at first. Scotty told me they did it to stay away from Colonel Parker and to be the big stars in their own hotels. "We've got our own situations," he said. "It's probably best if we keep them separate." On the road, one of my other responsibilities was to go into the audiences at intermission, find the best-looking girls, and invite them back to our hotel for a party. I'd walk up to a group of beautiful girls and say, "How you doing?" They'd look at me like I was crazy. I'd show them my backstage pass and some pictures of me with Elvis, and eventually they'd believe me. Every night, those girls would be waiting for me in the hotel lobby. I'd take them up to Elvis's room for a party, the kind of party that quite often got a little wild. Even on the train rides between cities, we were thinking about girls. On one trip, our sleeping compartment was next to a very striking woman. The compartments were separated by removable walls with a small gap at the bottom. Jean came up with the idea of using a butter knife to peek through the gap. We all ended up on the floor, trying to see something. I couldn't see anything, but Elvis and Jean thought it was hilarious. "What do you see, cuz?" Jean asked Elvis. "I see a butter knife," Elvis replied, which made us all laugh. But the real shock came after the tour. when Elvis took a starlet named Yvonne Lime out for a day of snake hunting. We were having a nice time until Arthur Hooton gave Yvonne a playful hug, which startled her. Elvis, who hadn't seen what happened, suddenly had his gun up to Arthur's head. "You do that again, and I'll blow your effing head off," Elvis growled. It was the first time I saw how dark Elvis's moods could become. I'd seen him handle so many crazy situations with grace, but this was different. It was a reminder that even the biggest stars were just regular human beings underneath it all. A few months later, I was over at Audubon Drive, hanging out with Elvis before he left for California to work on his next film. Freddie Bienstock, the liaison for the music publishing company, brought over a stack of acetate demo recordings. We listened to several songs, but nothing really grabbed Elvis until he played a demo of Jailhouse Rock, written by Mike Stoller and Jerry Leiber. Even as a demo, the song was incredible. "Damn Elvis," I said. "Little Richard would give his right arm for something like that." "Yeah, but he ain't getting it," Elvis replied. "That's the one I'm cutting." As we boarded the train to California, Elvis asked me to stay with him in his compartment. He wanted to work on his script for the new film. We spent the trip reading lines and practicing, and as we got into the more intense scenes, Elvis opened up in a way he never had before. He talked about the people who had doubted him, the ones who had told him he wouldn't amount to anything. He mentioned Eddie Bond, the disc jockey who had rejected him, and Jim Denny from the Grand Ole Opry, who had told him to keep driving a truck. He even talked about his audition for Arthur Godfrey's show, where he and the band had been laughed at. Elvis looked out the window at the passing lights, a twisted smile on his face. "I wonder what they think now," he said quietly. "All the guys who put me down and told me I wouldn't amount to anything. What do they think now?" We talked and talked and talked some more. Elvis had Gene and Arthur bring us dinner, and we kept going. I told him about my radio career, the good times and the bad, and stories about Dewey Phillips. I shared more personal stuff than I ever had with anyone. Elvis opened up too, telling me about his journey, not all of it easy. He mentioned a time after an Ed Sullivan show, when a beautiful European starlet kissed him in ways he never imagined. "I don't know what she did, but I didn't fight it," he laughed. When we got serious about careers, Elvis shared a crucial moment. "Sam Phillips gave me the best advice ever. He said, whatever you do, don't let them change your style. He warned me about the country guys in Nashville. They didn't like what I was doing and might try to change me. I had to stand up for myself, and I did." At his first Nashville session, Chet Atkins, the famous country guitarist, tried to give Scotty Moore tips. Elvis remembered Sam's words and stepped in. "Mr. Atkins, we appreciate your guidance, but we've got our own style." Atkins was a bit upset, but Elvis had to do it. "My career was on the line," he said. They still nod at each other, but they don't talk much. Elvis and I talked through the night. He hated strings on rock and roll records and wasn't happy that Marty Robbins recorded "That's All Right, Mama," after Elvis showed him how to play it. We shared memories of the Memphis fairgrounds and talked about gospel music. Somewhere along the way, I realized Elvis was more than just a rising star. He was my closest friend. Life in Hollywood with Elvis was amazing. We stayed at the luxurious Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Elvis had the presidential suite, which was huge. Gene and Arthur and I had our own penthouse rooms. We'd have breakfast on the rooftop terrace and feel like kings. Cliff Gleaves joined us, and his excitement about Hollywood was contagious. The band checked into the Knickerbocker Hotel nearby, and the Colonel was a few floors below us. Elvis's first job was to record the soundtrack for his new film. Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, who wrote hits like Hound Dog, were developing the songs. At first, they weren't thrilled about working with Elvis, but they soon saw how hard he worked and how much he knew about music. They became a great team. Jailhouse Rock was the theme song, and Elvis nailed it on the first day. Everyone knew it was going to be a hit. On the second day, things got tricky. MGM wanted to save money by recording on a movie lot soundstage. Elvis agreed but wasn't comfortable. He warmed up by singing gospel tunes, and by noon they were still singing. The studio people told the Jordanaires not to join him, but Elvis was insistent. "Who signs your check, me or MGM?" They sang for another 4 hours, and no recording was done. After the session, we all went back to the hotel. Elvis was quiet, and when we got to the suite, he went straight to the den. He started playing pool but got angry and started breaking things. He shattered glass, mirrors, and paintings. When he ran out of things to break, he flipped the pool table and kicked it. He then went to his room and didn't come out. We called the colonel, who came up and told us to cover the damage with sheets. He went downstairs and told the hotel we'd had a wild party and would pay for everything. The next day, Elvis was back to work, singing gospel and then recording the rest of the soundtrack. Elvis was only 22, but he cared deeply about his music. He was willing to do what was asked, but when his process was threatened, he could get very angry. Jean, Arthur, Cliff, and I tried to support him, but it was a lot to handle. Elvis decided to take us out for a night on the town. Dean Martin, one of Elvis's favorite singers, was performing at the Moulin Rouge. We went to see Dean's show, and after, Elvis asked if I wanted to meet him. Dean and Elvis had met before, and Dean was happy to see him again. Elvis turned to me and said, "Dean gave me the best advice in Hollywood. He said, be natural, don't try to act until you know how. That got me through 2 movies." Dean laughed, but he seemed to appreciate Elvis's gratitude. You can hear Dean's influence in Elvis's song, Suspicion. One evening at the Moulin Rouge, we caught a performance by Billy Ward and the Dominoes. They were still rocking out a great version of 60-Minute Man. Billy Ward spotted Elvis in the audience and introduced him as Elvis the Mighty Pelvis Presley. Elvis had never been too keen on the Pelvis nickname, but this time he leaned over to me with a smile and said, "You know, the way Billy Ward puts the mighty in there, I kind of like it." A few days later, Elvis reported to the MGM lot for his new movie, Jailhouse Rock. He got the biggest, nicest dressing room, which used to belong to Clark Gable. I was thrilled to be there, watching everything like it was my own showbiz school. I was fascinated by how sets were built, how scenes were lit, and how actors were directed. Most of the time, the other guys were off playing cards or flirting, but I watched everything closely. Sometimes there was a lot of downtime on set. I'd wander around the lot to see what else was happening. One day Elvis, Cliff Cleaves, and I went to say hello to Yul Brynner on the set of The Brothers Karamazov. We didn't see Yul, but we were caught by the director, Richard Brooks, who yelled at us to get off the set. Later, when Brooks found out who we'd booted, he invited Elvis back, and we even got to hang out with Yul. Another day, Cliff and I found an empty rehearsal room and started playing a piano. A dapper older gentleman joined us. Cliff played a new song and asked for his opinion. The man said it was nice but needed work. It turned out to be Cole Porter, who was working on the musical Less Girls. Meeting movie stars up close was a real thrill. I remember running out of Elvis's dressing room to get a good look at Kim Novak. Other times, Hollywood folks came to me, hoping to get closer to Elvis. One of these was Vince Edwards, a young actor who would later star in the TV show Ben Casey. He became friends with Elvis and started hanging out at the Beverly Wilshire with us. So did Rafael Campos, a Latino character actor who delivered some of Elvis's favorite lines in Blackboard Jungle. Vince also introduced us to Billy Murphy, a bit player in war movies and westerns. Billy was a Hollywood character, always strutting around in black and speaking in mysterious tones. He called everyone Mr. One day, I asked Billy if he had made All-American at USC. He said he had, but someone else got the credit. That was Billy, for you always leaving things unsaid. One night, Robert Mitchum, a big Hollywood star, showed up at our door with a bottle of whiskey and a script. He and Elvis hit it off, talking about their tough backgrounds. Mitchum had come to Hollywood by hopping freight trains and eating at hobo villages. Elvis shared stories of fights he'd gotten into early in his career. Mitchum brought the script for Thunder Road, a film he wanted to make with Elvis. Elvis got excited and asked Mitchum to call Colonel Parker to work out the details. We even had a small dinner party at Mitchum's house, but the Colonel later nixed the project, claiming Elvis had too many obligations. As Jailhouse Rock production began, Elvis was nervous about the dance sequence for the title song. He was a rock and roll guy, not a Hollywood dancer. The choreographer, Alex Romero, tried to teach him the steps, but Elvis couldn't do them. Alex had a brilliant idea. He asked me to get Elvis's records and set up a speaker system. Elvis showed Alex his natural moves from his concerts. Alex then created a dance routine based on those moves. When Elvis tried it, he looked amazing. It became one of the best dance sequences in a rock and roll movie. During this time, I was in a Beverly Hills hospital getting a nose job, a gift from Elvis. He had heard about a top plastic surgeon and offered to pay for it. While I was recovering, Elvis called to check on me. He was in the hospital too, having inhaled a dental cap. The studio dentist thought he had swallowed it, but Elvis knew something was wrong. He was rushed to the hospital, and the cap was suctioned out of his lung. He was feeling better when he asked me how the nurses looked. A big guy named Lamar Fike, a friend from Memphis, drove to Los Angeles when he heard Elvis was in the hospital. Lamar moved into the presidential suite with us. A few days later, Elvis and I were back on set. Elvis showed me around to admire my new nose. When we went to the makeup department, a studio barber accidentally cut a chunk of Elvis's hair. Elvis stayed calm and told the makeup man to just cover it up. In a situation where many stars would have lost their temper, Elvis stuck up for the barber. On our last day in Los Angeles, Elvis and I drove through Beverly Hills. We passed an old lady selling maps to the stars' homes. Elvis stopped the car, talked to her, and bought all her maps. It was a small act of kindness that reminded me of Elvis's generosity and compassion. Whether it was his friends in Memphis, a studio barber, or an old lady in a beach chair, Elvis always found a way to share his spirit with everyone. At the end of June, Elvis and the rest of us boarded a train back to Memphis. Junior, Gene Smith's brother, joined us for the ride. Junior was a tough guy who had served in the Korean War and came home with what they used to call shell shock. He was a heavy drinker and a chain smoker, but when he was sober, he was sharp and funny. One night in our hotel suite, Junior said to Elvis, "'Cause I ain't no queer, but you're a good-looking son of a bitch." This made us laugh because the gossip magazines were always saying we were either sex maniacs or a group of rowdy southern homosexuals. When we got back to Memphis, it felt strange to settle back into regular life. I was back in my mom's little house, and it was a big change from the fancy penthouse in Beverly Hills. But Elvis wanted us to enjoy his new home, Graceland, with him. He and his family had just moved in, and the place was amazing. There were new gates at the entrance, and the inside was fully redecorated. It was luxurious, but it still felt like a comfortable home. Elvis set up the basement of Graceland, like a rock and roll clubhouse. There was a game room with a pool table, and a TV room with low couches, a jukebox, and a bar. The week we got back, we planned a big 4th of July party, but we ended up partying in the basement all night on the 3rd. I got home around dawn, but Elvis showed up at my door around 9 in the morning. "Have you heard?" he asked. "No, Elvis. What's wrong?" Judy Tyler and her husband got killed in a car accident. Judy was Elvis's co-star in Jailhouse Rock, and they had become good friends. He was really upset and wanted to keep moving, so we drove around Memphis all day. He talked about Judy, how good a person she was, and how much he wished she could see the movie. I'd never seen Elvis so sad before, and it made me want to help him. We just drove and talked for hours. A couple of days later, we were all in the Graceland basement watching a local TV show called Dance Party. The host, Wink Martindale, had a pretty co-host named Anita Wood. I had been telling Elvis how great she was, and he said, "Set it up." I called Anita, and she agreed to go out with Elvis. When we went to pick her up, Elvis stayed in the car because some fans were following us. I went to the door, and a lady named Miss Patty answered. She ran the boarding house where Anita lived. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm George Klein, here to pick up Anita for her evening with Elvis." Miss Patty looked out at the cars and frowned. If Elvis were a real gentleman, he'd come to the door. I went back to the car and explained to Elvis. He laughed and got out to meet Miss Patty and Anita. He was polite and charming, and by the time we left, Miss Patty seemed convinced that Elvis was a real gentleman. We went out for a drive and some hamburgers, and it was clear that Elvis really liked Anita. She was smart, strong, and beautiful, and she became the most serious girl, and he had had up to that point. With all the time Elvis spent with Anita, his family, and the gang, it was hard to get a moment alone with him, but I needed to talk to him about something. I had realized that I missed radio, and I wanted to go back to it. One afternoon, I went up to Elvis's bedroom. "Elvis, you're the best friend I've ever had. and I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me. You don't have to thank me, GK. What's wrong? Elvis, I miss radio. I'd like to stop traveling with you and try to get back into it. I don't want to say goodbye to my own dreams completely. Elvis nodded. I don't blame you at all, GK. You should do what you love. But remember, you're always welcome to come back with me anytime, and you'll still come over here whenever I'm home. I felt really supported by Elvis. He had taken me into his world of rock and roll, Hollywood, and fame, but he wasn't upset that I wanted to step away to pursue my own career. I got in touch with my old mentor, Bill Grumbles, at WHBQ. He offered me an afternoon slot before Dewey Phillips's show. It sounded great, but Dewey and I weren't as close as we used to be. Things got complicated when Dewey visited Elvis in Hollywood. He rubbed people the wrong way, and even embarrassed Elvis in front of Yul Brynner. Dewey also played Elvis's new single, Teddy Bear, before it was released, and he scared Elvis's parents one night by showing up drunk at Graceland. When I went to meet with the station managers at WHBQ, they told me Dewey would quit if they hired me. The station decided to stick with Dewey, and I felt terrible. I was so hurt and angry that I told a reporter about Dewey's drunk incident at Graceland. The next day, Elvis saw the story in the newspaper. Did you see this, GK? I felt awful. I told Elvis the truth. Elvis, I can't lie to you. I told the reporter about Dewey. I was hurt and angry, and I did it for revenge. I'm sorry, Elvis. I'm sorry for you and your parents. Elvis taught me a valuable lesson that day. If you ever created a problem involving Elvis, the best thing to do was to tell him straight up. He respected honesty, and it helped us stay close for years to come. Hours later, a group of us was getting ready to go to a private midnight movie screening. Elvis made it clear that our friendship was still solid. So, GK, you don't have another radio job lined up? He asked. No, Elvis, not yet. We got a Northwest tour coming up. I think you better come along. I could do that. If WHBQ wasn't ready to let me do some rockin' and rollin' in Memphis, I'd hit the road and do some more rockin' and rollin' with the King. The Northwest tour, at the end of the summer of 1957, was wild. Elvis had gone from being a singing star to an absolute national sensation. It wasn't just the young girls who wanted to get close to him. He could create a commotion just about everywhere he went. As our train headed into some remote stretches of the American West, hundreds of people would show up at tiny depots to watch us speed by. When the train made its stops in small towns, it seemed like the entire population was there trying to get a look at Elvis. At a couple of stops, when they didn't get the glimpse they were after, the crowd decided to try to shake Elvis out and actually started pushing on the train hard enough to rock it on its tracks. I wanted to think there was no way a crowd could tip a whole train over, but the panicked look on the faces of some of the conductors made me think otherwise. The nights were quieter, and Lamar, Cliff, and I discovered the beauty of the train's dome car, the glass-topped lounge that allowed for some amazing views of the star-filled western sky. Elvis usually stayed in his cabin to avoid creating a scene, but one late night, as we wound our way through the Rocky Mountains, the dome car was empty, and he came out to join us. We were enjoying ourselves when a young teenage girl entered the car. She came down the aisle and stopped next to Elvis, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Johnny Cash," she said in an excited whisper. We started laughing, but Elvis quickly hushed us and started talking to the girl. She told him how much she loved his Johnny Cash's records, and how she'd been to one of his Cash's shows. Finally, she asked, "Johnny, would you sing me one of your songs?" Elvis wouldn't sing one of his own songs in that situation, but for this little Johnny Cash fan, he dropped his voice to its lowest notes and started singing a few lines of "Hey Porter," a song Cash had cut at Sun that seemed especially appropriate for a midnight train ride. The girl was thrilled and even ended up with an autograph from Elvis, which read, "Best wishes, Johnny Cash." The commotion we experienced on the train was only magnified at concerts. In Vancouver, I was sent to scout out the football field where Elvis was going to perform for 25,000 fans. A stage had been set up at one end of the field, with a series of iron spikes set in front of it as a small security barrier. But there were no seats on the field. Tickets had been sold to fill only the open bleachers around the field. The Royal Mounties were going to provide security, and I asked one what was going to stop fans from rushing out of the stands. He told me it had been well publicized that anyone who stepped on the field would be fined $100. I told him to get ready to write a whole lot of tickets. As the evening began, people took their seats and stayed off the field. The concert started with Elvis in his gold suit, taking a kind of pre-show warm-up lap as he sat on the back of a Cadillac convertible and was driven around the field's track to wave hello to everybody. Right away, you could feel a rumble of excitement rising to a barely containable level. When the car got Elvis to the stage, he ran up, ready to start with his big opener, Heartbreak Hotel. And he did something he liked to do. He really milked that first word. Wellel. Boom. 25,000 Canadians charged the stage, not slowed in the least by the threat of a $100 ticket. The first ones to get close to the stage bounded right over the security spikes, even ripping some of them out of the ground. It was scary enough that even Colonel Parker looked taken aback. He had us run out and get Elvis off the stage and into a makeshift backstage area. The Colonel told Elvis that if he played with the audience and got them worked up anymore, we'd be lucky to get out of there alive. Calm them down, said the Colonel. Tell them to get in their seats, and you'll give them a good show. Elvis went out and managed to calm the crowd down. It took about 20 minutes before everyone was off the field and back in their seats. Finally, the band took its place, and Elvis started the show again. Since my baby left me, he sang, giving his leg one of its famous shakes. Boom, the same scene all over again. This time even more of the security spikes were ripped out, and more people got right up to the stage, which wasn't all that substantial to begin with. We whisked Elvis backstage again, and then I saw something I'd never seen before. Colonel Parker himself hustled out on stage and grabbed Elvis's microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, "this is a security situation. You cannot charge the stage. You're putting Elvis and yourselves at risk of injury. You must take your seats." All those Canadians just stood on the field, staring at him, not making a move toward the seats. After a quick meeting with the Royal Mounties, the Colonel addressed the crowd again and told them that they could stay on the field if they didn't rush the stage. Elvis went out again and did a quick 30-minute set, then ran off as quick as he could, sprinting around the limo that had brought us there to jump into a police car behind it. As he sped off, Bill Black, DJ Fontana, Scotty Moore, and I jumped into the limo. Scotty was at the wheel, but before he could pull away, fans swarmed all over the car, thinking Elvis was somewhere behind the tinted windows. They started rocking the car, and just about pulling it apart, somebody tore the license plate off. Another got the antenna. It was terrifying, and poor Scotty wasn't sure what to do. I hollered for him to lay on the horn and step on the gas, and we managed to start moving forward without rolling over anybody. I remember looking out the back window and seeing a full rock and roll riot breaking out. The fans had knocked over and demolished the entire stage, grabbing up broken bits of wood and music gear for souvenirs. I also noted one delicate detail. The sheets of paper on which the band had written their set lists were floating through the air, just above the chaos. After a few more equally crazy concerts, we were back in Los Angeles, where Elvis was going to record a Christmas album for RCA at Radio Recorder's studio. Elvis had a good time bringing his style to some holiday classics, and he was particularly happy when he and the band worked up a version of White Christmas, patterned after one by Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters. Despite some criticism, it sounded great to me. Elvis was working closely again with Leiber and Stoller, whom he'd come to think of as his good luck charms in the studio. At one of the session breaks, Elvis asked the writers if they could come up with a pretty ballad for him. This wasn't their specialty, but they said they'd try and left the studio. Elvis continued recording, and at the end of the day, we went back to our Los Angeles home, the wonderful Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Late that night, I answered a knock at the door of the presidential suite to find Leiber and Stoller standing there with an acetate. In less than a day, they'd written a song for Elvis and cut a demo of it with a popular session singer named Young Jesse. Elvis wanted to hear it right away, so we all headed to the den that had a record player. Elvis put the record on, and as soon as the song began, he looked as happy as a kid on Christmas morning. I felt it too. The song, Don't, was a little masterpiece. "Oh shit," I said. "That's great." "Oh shit is right," said Elvis. "I'm cutting this tomorrow." He did, and his performance of the song made it even more of a masterpiece. Unfortunately, the Colonel turned up in the studio while the song was being recorded. and when he found out that the writers had brought a song straight to Elvis instead of going through Hill and Range Publishing, he hit the roof and chewed out the writers like they were misbehaving brats rather than artists who just created Elvis's next #1 hit. His lack of appreciation for their talents was made increasingly clear the following day. When Elvis mentioned to the writers that he really liked Charles Brown's sexy holiday song, Merry Christmas Baby, Leiber and Stoller disappeared into a little room in the back of the studio for no more than 20 minutes and came back with Santa Claus is Back in Town for Elvis. Elvis loved it, but the Colonel's comment to the writers was, "What took you so long?" Unfortunately, the writers weren't the only talents around Elvis that the Colonel failed to appreciate. When Elvis first began recording and performing, he and Scotty Moore and Bill Black had come up with a handshake agreement that would give each of the musicians a percentage of everything Elvis earned. But when the Colonel signed Elvis, Scotty, and Bill became salaried players, and not very highly salaried players at that. As a small bonus, Elvis had said that Scotty, Bill, and J could use some of his session time at radio recorders to cut some of their own instrumentals, which they intended to release as the EP Continentals. After Elvis finished his Christmas album work, Scotty and Bill began to move their equipment around for their own session. That's when Tom Diskin, the Colonel's not much liked lieutenant, appeared and told them that there had been a change of plans. They weren't going to get any session time after all. I'd been standing around looking forward to hearing what the guys had put together, and it was awful to see the change that came over them. Bill Black was furious, slamming his bass into its case and kicking around music stands. Scotty, always such a calm, steady presence, was as angry as I'd ever seen him, and it was painful to watch him trying to hold it in and remain professional. DJ just muttered to himself, making sure Diskin heard a few of the words intended for him. I eased out of there and found Elvis in his limo, and we headed back to the hotel. I wasn't sure if Elvis was aware of what Diskin had done, but he didn't look too happy either. We weren't back at the hotel an hour when a letter was delivered to the suite. The letter was respectful in tone, almost apologetic, but its meaning was clear. Bill and Scotty were resigning. Elvis was hurt, but I think he knew the guys had very good reason to be quitting. He wanted to be fair to them, but didn't know how to deal with something that fell between friendship and business. And I think I realized for the first time that for all the Colonel's loud confidence, he could be absolutely wrong about something. Here the Colonel had a chance to manage 2 acts for the price of 1, and to have a great built-in opening act for every Elvis concert. Keeping Bill and Scotty happy would have made sense in terms of the bottom line, but more important, it would have kept Elvis working with musicians he loved and trusted, guys who'd been there from the first take of That's All Right, Mama. A few weeks later, Elvis was scheduled to do a charity concert in his hometown, Tupelo, Mississippi, his second big show there. A couple of other players were hired for the show. Guitarist Hank, Sugarfoot, Garland, and bassist Chuck Wigington, and J agreed to stay on. Garland already had a reputation as a top session guy in Nashville, and there was no denying that he was talented. But after the show, I said to Elvis, "These guys are great, but something was a little off. It just didn't have the same energy." "I know, GK," he said. "The feel wasn't there. Scotty and Bill aren't the greatest technical players in the world, but man, they've got that feel." The whole trip to Tupelo was slightly bittersweet. Of course, Elvis was celebrated there as a hometown hero, but for him, the town did not hold many pleasant memories. It was a place where his family had been dirt poor, and had struggled mightily to get by. I'd been with him on the road when some Tupelo guys he'd known came up to his hotel room. They told some stories and had some laughs, but after they left, Elvis said, "They kept saying, 'Remember Tupelo, remember Tupelo.' Man, I don't want to remember Tupelo, those were hard times." Before we headed back to Memphis, we spent an evening at the very nice home of Ikey Savory, one of Tupelo's most prominent citizens. At one point, Elvis leaned over to me and said, "5 years ago this guy wouldn't have let me cut his grass. Now he's serving me dinner, kind of strange." I felt Elvis needed some fun and some distraction, so I suggested we go to the Monday night wrestling matches at Ellis Auditorium. A guy from our neighborhood who had gone to Hume's was the stage manager on those nights and brought us in the back door, sitting us in a VIP section on the stage side of the wrestling ring. Elvis really enjoyed watching the lady wrestlers take each other on, and we saw quite a few good female matches that night. Elvis was particularly impressed by an attractive wrestler named Penny Banner, and was happily surprised when, after her match, she came over to where we were sitting to tell Elvis what a big fan of his she was. "Well, I like the way you wrestle, honey," was his response. Anita Wood was about as serious a girlfriend as Elvis wanted at the time. She'd come on the road with him, stayed at the Beverly Wilshire with him as the Christmas album was being finished, and was with him for the trip to Tupelo. Elvis always spoke fondly of her, and wanted her with him constantly. She was always a part of group outings and parties at Graceland. But Anita was also busy pursuing her own show business career, and while I think she knew that Elvis was devoted to her when he was with her, she must have also known Elvis Presley was not going to be a typical steady boyfriend. So, Elvis being Elvis, he wasn't going to let the opportunity to get closer to a lady wrestler slip away. Penny Banner ended up coming back to Graceland with us, and this wasn't one of those communal, let's go get hamburgers dates. Elvis and Penny went straight upstairs to work on their own wrestling moves, and I was left alone. We were all hanging out at my place in North Memphis when Lamar called me out of the blue. "Pack," he said. I didn't know what he meant, so I asked, "What do you mean, pack?" Lamar just said, "We're going to Las Vegas." That was Elvis for you. He liked to do things on a whim. Within a few hours, Elvis, Cliff, Gene, Lamar, and I were on a train to Vegas for a 10-day vacation. The train took us through Kansas City, where we had a 10-hour layover at the Mulebach Hotel. When we got to our rooms, there were gift baskets of food and some fancy bottles of whiskey waiting for us. Elvis didn't drink, and neither did I, but Cliff and Gene were all about the hard stuff. Elvis, being Elvis, opened those bottles and poured them down the sink. Cliff and Gene were practically crying, but Elvis was firm. "Nobody's getting drunk tonight." When it was time to catch our next train, we followed the Colonel's plan. We took cabs to the back entrance of the station, where we met the station master and were escorted to the train. But as we walked in, we were greeted by a shocking sight: 5,000 screaming girls. A local DJ had been talking about which train Elvis might be on, and a sorority convention was in town. The place was packed with girls who all wanted to get their hands on Elvis. They charged at us, and we started running. We sprinted out a side door, around some corners, and ended up running across the train yard. Elvis, being the quick thinker he was, darted under a boxcar. We joined him, huddled together, and listened for our pursuers. I thought it was crazy that the same guy who had taken me to a Beverly Hills penthouse was now crouching behind a greasy freight train. I went back inside to find the station master, and when I told him Elvis was hiding under a train, he was both surprised and impressed. He helped us get to our train just in time. We checked into the Sahara Hotel in Vegas. The next morning, Elvis called us for breakfast. I had packed some flashy clothes for the nights out, but I also thought there'd be some downtime. I made the mistake of showing up in boxer shorts and a t-shirt. Elvis wouldn't let me sit down. "GK, go back and put some damn clothes on," he snapped. I went to get dressed, and by the time I came back, my pancakes were cold. Later, as we got ready to go out on the strip, I announced in my deepest, smoothest voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, George Klein, live from Las Vegas, the entertainment capital of the world, with Mr. Elvis Presley, the #1 entertainer in the world." Elvis loved it and had me do it over and over again, each time with more flair. One night, Elvis picked up a stunning young woman at a casino and told us he was taking her home. We expected him back by the end of the night, but as the hours rolled by, we got worried. Finally, around 7 in the morning, he came in with a little grin. "Elvis, where the hell have you been?" I asked. He explained that he left his car running while he went inside with the girl. When he came back out, the car was dead. He started walking and hitchhiked back to the hotel. The first car that stopped was driven by a young girl who recognized him and gave him a ride. Another night, we saw a show by Tempest Storm, a famous stripper known for her red hair and, as she called them, moneymakers. After the show, she wanted to meet Elvis. We weren't invited, but Elvis spent the night at her apartment. He had a photo taken with her, which the Colonel didn't like because it made the papers and portrayed Elvis in a negative light. Elvis told us, "I didn't date her, I just spent the night with her." After Vegas, we met up with the band in San Francisco for a string of West Coast concerts. Bill and Scotty had agreed to a gig-by-gig contract, and with DJ Fontana and the Jordanaires, the lineup sounded great. but it was hard not to feel that some of the magic was gone because of the Colonel's focus on money. One night, a call came that someone was at the stage door asking for me. It was Rabbi Alfred Fruchter, the rabbi from the North Memphis temple I used to attend. He had been transferred to San Francisco, and just wanted to say hello. I was surprised he knew I'd be with Elvis, but I was happy to see him. He asked if he could meet Elvis, and I went to check. Elvis's eyes lit up when I told him who was there. "I know Rabbi Fruchter. I used to live with him, get him back here." Elvis explained that he had lived in a boarding house, where the Fruchters were upstairs neighbors. He used to work as the rabbi's Shabbos goy, helping with tasks on the Sabbath. The rabbi had also let the Presleys use his phone, saving them money. Elvis and the rabbi had a great time backstage, and Elvis insisted that Rabbi Fruchter join him at a press conference. The reporters were surprised when Elvis introduced him as my rabbi. After San Francisco, we went to Los Angeles and checked into the Beverly Wilshire. Elvis was set to perform at the Pan Pacific Auditorium. We were joined by Vince Edwards, Billy Murphy, and Nick Adams, who had introduced Elvis to Natalie Wood. At the first show, the Colonel had a large plastic statue of Nipper the dog on stage. Elvis had a lot of fun singing to Nipper and rolling around on the floor. He was trying to impress the showbiz crowd, but some people in the audience thought he was vulgar, and the reviews the next day were harsh. For the second show, the Los Angeles Police Department warned Elvis that they would film the concert and use the footage to prosecute him if he did anything vulgar. The story spread, and when Elvis came on stage, he shuffled like a guy on a chain gang with his hands held out like they were cuffed. The crowd knew what he was doing and went wild. He held up a hand and wiggled one finger, and the crowd went even crazier. The cops couldn't really say a man standing still with one wiggling finger was vulgar. Elvis gave the crowd a great show without being overly wild. The party at the Beverly Wilshire after the show was amazing. Ricky Nelson, Venetia Stevenson, and Sammy Davis Jr. were there. Sammy and Nick Adams did hilarious Brando imitations. Billy Murphy, in his all-black outfit, entertained and spooked people. Cliff mentioned some problems with a girl, and Billy said, "The shark has got bad brakes." He meant his old car had bad brakes, and if a certain lady took a ride with him, anything could happen. Cliff wasn't interested, but Billy said, "Well, if you need it, mister, the shark has bad brakes." Elvis wasn't happy when Farron Young, a country and film star, showed up with another guy. I didn't know who the other guy was, but Elvis did. He said, "That's Jim Denny, the mother that kicked me off the Grand Ole Opry." Elvis was polite to Denny in front of Farron, but once they left, he went on a foul-mouthed tirade. Elvis would forgive, but he never forgot. Halloween was a few days after the Pan Pacific shows. We were invited to a party thrown by Sid DeVore, a famous Hollywood tailor. Elvis didn't want to go, but Billy Murphy showed up with a handmade Mardi Gras mask. Elvis loved it and decided to go. We scrambled to get ready and ended up wearing Lone Ranger masks from a drugstore. The party was incredible. I thought a cute little clown was flirting with me until Cliff pointed out it was Debbie Reynolds, sitting on Eddie Fisher's lap. Joan Collins, a stunning beauty, was there in a costume made of nothing but playing cards. It was a night to remember. The party rooms at Graceland were buzzing with excitement when I walked in and saw something I never thought I'd see. Nat King Cole dressed as Elvis Presley. He had on a black leather jacket, sideburns, and even a guitar. I couldn't believe it. Elvis and I always loved Nat King Cole's music, so I went straight up to him and introduced myself. He was super nice, and when he heard I was with Elvis, he said he really wanted to meet him. I went to find Elvis, but he was busy talking to some pretty girls. I told him about Nat King Cole, and he immediately wanted to meet him. The sight of Elvis, dressed up for Mardi Gras, talking to Nat King Cole was something I'll never forget. A few weeks later, in early November 1957, we left Los Angeles for a trip to Hawaii. The Colonel had booked some concerts in Honolulu, and we were excited to spend time in the tropical paradise. Elvis, being the devoted son he was, insisted on taking a ship instead of flying, just as he had promised his mom. When we got ready to leave the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, we ran into Billy Murphy, holding a suitcase tied with a rope. Billy thought he was coming with us because Elvis had mentioned the trip to him. We explained there was no ticket for him, but Elvis just shrugged and told Tom Diskin to get him a ticket. Diskin was hesitant, but I convinced him that telling Elvis no would not be a good idea. By the time we got to the dock, Billy was on board with us. The trip on the USS Matsonia was fun, especially with Billy around. One night at dinner, Billy stood up and said to Cliff, "Mr. Gleaves, you're colorful and interesting, but you're 90% bullshit and 10% lies." Cliff couldn't argue with that. When we arrived in Hawaii, the Colonel had local authorities lined up to meet us, but we preferred the welcome from the beautiful Hawaiian girls who gave us leis and kisses. Elvis ended up with so many leis that his face was barely visible, and his cheeks were covered in lipstick. We stayed at the Kaiser Hawaiian Village Hotel, and Elvis's suite was the fanciest. Cliff and I were curious about who else had stayed there, and the clerk told us it had been Mike Todd and Elizabeth Taylor's honeymoon suite. We couldn't resist jumping on the bed and rolling around, saying we'd been in the same bed as Elizabeth Taylor. There was some work to do for Elvis's concerts, but Cliff and I mostly just enjoyed the island. We ordered fresh coconuts and pineapple from room service, and spent mornings on the beach. One morning, we brought a radio and listened to Roy Orbison's Ooby Dooby. It was surreal to be in Hawaii, listening to a song recorded in Memphis. There was a radio station on the top floor of the hotel, and the DJ, Tom Moffat and Ron Jacobs, called me and asked for an interview. They knew they couldn't get Elvis, but I agreed to do it. I told them about meeting Elvis, traveling with him, and his recordings. I also mentioned how Elvis was a great producer, even though he didn't get much credit for it. He knew exactly how to bring a song to life in the studio, often drawing on his experiences with Sam Phillips. Elvis was more than just a voice. He was a visionary in the studio. When I got back to the suite, Elvis was waiting for me. He had heard the interview and thanked me for giving him credit for his work in the studio. It meant a lot to him. Later, Tom Diskin confronted me about the unauthorized interview, but I stood my ground. I told him I had cleared it with Elvis, and that was all that mattered. Just before Christmas, Elvis received a draft notice. It was a shock. We had heard rumors, but no one thought it would actually happen. Elvis was devastated. He had just finished a successful movie, Jailhouse Rock, and his Christmas album was topping the charts. The idea of putting his career on hold for 2 years was terrifying. He was more worried about losing his success than about the physical dangers of the Army. I felt guilty because I had just started a new job at Way, a radio station near Memphis, and now Elvis was facing this major setback. Despite the draft notice, we still had fun back in Memphis. Graceland was always magical, and we threw parties in the basement. We'd invite beautiful girls, but the point wasn't to get drunk or hook up. It was to enjoy each other's company. We'd play games like Name That Tune, and Elvis would tease me for being bad at it. There was a real sweetness to those Graceland nights. I also introduced Elvis to my family during that holiday season. My mom and sister, Dorothy, met Elvis and they hit it off. My sister told Elvis he had beautiful blue eyes, and my mom said he was better looking than Clark Gable. Elvis loved it. The draft notice loomed over everything, but Colonel Parker managed to get Elvis a 90-day deferment so he could finish his next film, King Creole. We even considered an offer from the Air Force, where Elvis would be a public relations officer, but the colonel said it would look bad if Elvis got preferential treatment, so we declined. Elvis's future was uncertain, but for now, we were just trying to enjoy the moments we had together. As I spent more time working for Sam Phillips at Way, I felt like I was right where I belonged. Sam was more than just a boss. He was a mentor and a friend. He understood the music business from every angle and always treated me with respect, whether I was just starting out or becoming more established. Working with him, I learned so much about the industry and the passion it takes to succeed. When I wasn't on the air at Way, I often visited Graceland to spend time with Elvis. He was getting ready to head back to Los Angeles to film King Creole, and it was clear that the stress of his work and military obligations was weighing on him. One Sunday, we decided to play badminton to relax. It started as a fun game, but things got a bit too competitive, especially between Cliff and Lamar. Cliff, who claimed he was a college badminton champion, got ribbed by Lamar every time he missed a shot. The tension boiled over, and Cliff attacked Lamar with his badminton racket, breaking it and knocking Lamar over. Mrs. Presley was upset, and Mr. Presley and Elvis had to calm them down. Elvis asked Cliff and Lamar to move out temporarily, but they were eventually forgiven and welcomed back. Before Elvis left for California, he asked me to join him again. I appreciated the offer, but I was happy at Way and didn't want to leave Sam so soon. Instead, I introduced him to my friend Alan Fortas, a huge Elvis fan. Alan became Elvis's new traveling companion, and they got along well. Back at Way, I was back in my element, and my listeners still remembered me from the rock and roll ballroom show. I started hosting record hops around town, setting up turntables and speakers to create live, high-energy DJ shows. It was an exciting time for rock and roll, with new hits like Jerry Lee Lewis's Great Balls of Fire and Sam Cooke's You Send Me, keeping everyone on their toes. Alan kept me updated on Elvis's time in Los Angeles, and one day he invited me to visit the set of King Creole in New Orleans. I took a long weekend off and headed down. When I arrived, I found Elvis working hard on what would become one of his best film performances. He was determined to prove himself as a serious actor, especially with his upcoming Army service on his mind. Despite the serious atmosphere, we still had our moments of fun, like when Cliff Gleaves convinced an extra to give us free blazers from his father's clothing shop. The Colonel was initially furious, but eventually impressed by Cliff's smarts. After finishing the film, Elvis returned to Memphis with just a week before he had to report for Army basic training. We spent most of our time at the Rainbow Roller Drome, where Elvis would rent out the whole rink after hours. He loved playing rough games with his friends, but I mostly stayed on the sidelines, especially with my bad back. The night before Elvis left for the Army, he took Anita Wood, Alan, and me out for a final date. We watched a movie called Sing Boy Sing, a film inspired by Elvis's life, and spent the rest of the night talking about old times. It felt like the end of an era, but we tried not to make it too emotional. Elvis looked sharp in his Army uniform when he came back to Memphis on furlough. He squeezed in a recording session and rented out the Memphis Fairgrounds, where he enjoyed the rides and games. It was a fun break for him before he returned to Fort Hood for advanced training. While Elvis was in the Army, I added a new chapter to my career. I became a recording artist at Sun Records. Jack Clement, a staff producer, had written a parody called The Return of Jerry Lee, inspired by the scandals surrounding Jerry Lee Lewis. We recorded it as a break-in record, with me playing the part of the interviewer. It was a fun project, and a great way to stay connected to the music I love. As Elvis's time in the Army continued, I focused on my radio career and the new opportunities that came with it. The world of rock and roll was always changing, but the bonds I had formed with people like Sam Phillips, Elvis, and my friends at Way remained strong. No matter where the road took us, I knew that the music and the memories would always be there to guide me.